I'm like Daniel, I'm with a nonprofit. We're actually all volunteers. We have a budget of 0, so we're here because we're interested in the subject. I personally, I think as I said, I have a background in finance and economics, so I've taken a lot of interest in that. But more than that, our group is interested in process and how you do things. And the idea is if you have a good process, you come out with a good outcome. And the lack of a good process has been a concern for us for several years now, and it's actually getting worse, not better. I understand next week the class will be about how the public can get involved in a project, and let me tell you how. You put your hand up and you say, oh, I'll go to that meeting, just that one meeting, and then 2 years later you're at a forum for high-speed rail. So as we're going back to the topic, I wanted to address first a couple of the things that we talked about, that were talked about earlier. And there is this idea if you increase transportation, generally that increases the number of people who want to live in your city. And generally that increases sprawl. So while I would say there are some cases in which you could see how it could change the way that people live, especially in cities that have really good existing transportation networks. They have subways, they have buses, they have everything. It might be more interesting to live near one of those stops that would connect you to the station downtown. But in general, people don't want to live near high-speed rail stations. There are taxis, there are buses. It's not an airport, but it's not a train station either. It's something in between those two. So we take it very seriously for the Central Valley that you have the risk, and it's probably the most likely outcome at this point, that you actually exacerbate all the sprawl issues. And so that's why how you do things and when you do things and what you do matters a lot. The second issue was that the Central Valley should be grateful that this project is coming to the Central Valley first. And I think, I do think, there are some temporary jobs that would come with this. But on the other hand, you're being asked to absorb all of the impacts. And when I talk about impacts, there are hot spots from air quality that will come from all the steel and concrete that will be required for this project. You will have the loss of all these businesses along the right-of-way, and you will have this loss of farmland in the hope that somehow we're going to come up with the other 97% of the money to finish it, and you might actually be able to take a train the next decade or the decade after that. So it's one of those things where, is that what you really want? And that's one of the questions we have, is when you're thinking about who you ask to take the first impacts, especially when you're not sure that you're going to finish a project, shouldn't it be someplace that can get some benefits at that point, some lasting benefits from it? So I think I would step back a little bit from that and be a little bit concerned about the one being asked to be the guinea pig on this. One of the biggest areas of concern that we have had is on the money. David mentioned the 97% of the money that's missing. I want to step back and talk about where the money comes from to pay for this. When we pass a bond measure on a state level, taxes don't go up, there's not an increase in sales tax, there's no additional money coming into that pot that we have to spend. All of the interest and all the principal payments on that money that we borrow come out of the general fund. And that general fund is what also pays for CSU. So that $10 billion that we're borrowing for just the first chunk, that's $700 million that we'll have to spend every year on just paying the interest. That equates to about $2,000 each year for every CSU student. So it's a big deal in this state when you decide to spend money out of the general fund. In some countries, it's not such a big deal because you can go out and borrow money. If you run out of money, you just go and borrow it. You don't have to cut something. Well, in California, we have spent decades now putting restrictions on our ability to raise taxes. So we have no more revenues. And it's getting harder and harder to actually increase revenues. And then we put more and more restrictions on the legislature about how they spend the money that we do have. So at the end of the day, there's a very small piece of that pot that's going to go to pay for things like high-speed rail. And now let's say the project goes over by, 10 or 20 or $30 billion. If that $10 billion was $2,000 for each of you here every year, and if we run out of the money, right, that comes in tuition, or fewer students, or all of those kinds of things, then imagine if you have to spend $40 billion on this. So there are some very serious issues when you're talking about this project. Yes, this is where I'm back with Daniel. I mean, there's a lot of things that I think Daniel and I would agree on as goals and things that we'd like to see at the end of the day, but the question is, will this project, especially as it's being conducted right now, get you to that goal? So the legislature knows this, right? They know that it's really a problem if you run out of money in California. They call it pot committed. That's if any of you ever played poker. Anyway, so at some point you put enough money in and you have to keep going, and you know that. And so with high-speed rail, people were really afraid that you do what they're talking about doing now, which is you build a bunch of tracks on which you're not going to run trains, and then you're just so embarrassed that you just keep throwing money at it, and you have to keep throwing money at it, money that you really don't want to be spending on that you'd rather be spending on things like CSU. So they put into the bond measure a lot of restrictions. And they said basically you can't start building until you have enough money secured to build like a high-speed rail system that will make enough money to support itself. Because they were really scared, because they've been in this situation before, and it always ends badly. And it does not end this badly in other states, in other countries, but in California, this is a real issue. And so we're going to see a business plan next week, and we're going to see, along with that, something called a funding plan, which the bond measure required. And they're going to say that they have a plan to get to, I don't know, 25 billion or something, whatever it would take to build from the Central Valley all the way to the Bay Area or to Los Angeles, but they don't actually have any money. So the legislature is going to be in a position where there'll be a funding plan that doesn't actually meet probably the letter or the spirit of the law, but they're still going to be asked to close their eyes and vote yes. Because if you don't, right, you're negative, you're a naysayer, you love cars, you're part of the oil industry, right, you hate farmland, you want sprawl, whatever it is, right, because that's where our dialogue is right now. It's in the name-calling level. And it's not just in the media that we have name-calling, it's actually on the project planning level, which is where we get into the other issue we have with this project, is it's being conducted like a permanent political campaign. You know, the part where somebody running for office is supposed to campaign, and then once they get in, they switch into actually like running the country or something. Well, they won the bond measure in 2008, but it's still being conducted like a political campaign. So anybody who has any criticism, I would call, we have constructive criticism, we're not invited. There's no interest in having that be part of the discussion. And that's bad for projects. You're making them in a bubble, and those never end well. And that's where you get into things where you do plans that are not good for cities. And this is back to, Daniel's interest in helping change the pattern of development, which we're very interested in that as well. But if you don't sit down with the cities and think about how you're going to have their grid of streets and stuff work, and how you're going to make sure that pedestrians can still cross streets, and you improve access to parks, not make it harder to get there, you're going to end up with something that makes things worse than they were before. So you want people sitting down at the table, and it's been very hard in this project because it suffers from what a lot of transportation projects these days suffer from, which is too many consultants. We call this project the No Consultant Left Behind Act. No offense, Mr. Wines. But they gave every 100 miles to a different consultant to plan, and then let them hire all of their own people, and then they hired consultants above them to manage it and consultants above them to manage it. So it's not working very well. And unless you dramatically change the way you do this, your chances of success with this are very low. And then we're back to what we talked about at the beginning. You've asked the Central Valley to take all the impact, to have the real negative impact on air quality because of all that steel and concrete and trucks and all this kind of stuff, and farmers' lands blocked without any actual benefit. And you've asked the state to absorb all this cost to the general fund without any commensurate benefit. So, I'd like to get to something which is a project that can be successful, but unless some serious things change, like that's not where we're headed. Yeah, we can keep heading ahead fast, but we're about to hit a brick wall. So I think that concludes things.